mesmerized, and I fell right into that study. And so my dissertation was on how children can help each other by conferring while they are writing. Like peer conferences, that was my area of study, and I enjoyed doing it. Then I was able to teach at Clark and at Fitchburg. And this book, From Habitants to Immigrants, the Sansoucys, the Harpins, and the Potvins, is the product of my old age. Leslie.
I'm Leslie Choquette, and I am the director of the French Institute at Assumption College, which is a small research center dedicated to the history of the French in North America in general, and French Canadians in New England in specific. And so I met Jackie when she was writing the book, and she had the great generosity to donate to us the original French family letters that she had between her family in Central Mass and her family in Quebec that got her started on writing this book project. So I'm here in a supporting role today since we're going to be talking about her book, but I will pipe up with some extra information from time to time, and we would both be happy to contribute to the discussion at the end of the formal presentation and answer questions and so forth.
I explain my work as macro and micro. And by that I mean, if a person writes a history of a people and they don't reflect what is happening to individuals and to families, that history can be barren, arid. It doesn't live, it's not alive, it doesn't sing. Right? If a person writes a history only of individuals and families without reflecting the geopolitical situations that have the forces that have an impact on their lives, the geopolitical, the economic, the cultural, then that story is incomplete. What I tried to do was to do both. So throughout my book, I had tried to keep that balance between what was going on in the larger world and how it affected these habitants in rural Canada, and yet portray their lives as flesh and blood real people. These habitants in Canada were living, they were living at a time, a very long period, during which the conflict, they were affected by the lengthy conflict between England and France over the control of North America. They were also affected very much by the imposition of the seigneurial system, of a method of controlling landholding in Canada. So again, what I tried to do was to connect that big picture and the little picture, the smaller picture throughout. My agenda for tonight, I will explain my research process, how I went about it, the sources that were really valuable to me, and the discoveries that I made, the surprising things that I discovered, and through all of the eras. Now, Leslie is a professional historian, steeped and deeply knowledgeable in the history of France and in Canada. So I'm honored to have her with me and to have her contributions. And we will speak in two voices, alternating my research, her profound knowledge. I also want to greet Margaret. Where is Margaret? I came to Margaret some time ago seeking to find out what I could about French Canadians who had settled in Southbridge, like my ancestors did. And she was most helpful.
There we go.
It's not my computer, I'm not familiar with it. But on on the front cover, I have, this is my great-grandfather's house, and it is on the Richelieu River. And my great-great-grandfather, Isaac Vel Sansoucy, was born in 1823. He was 50 years old when he married, and his father ceded this land to him. So the Sansoucys first settled on this land in 1720. And so this was the homestead for 5 generations of Sansoucys. Now, my the house, there was a house there, obviously since 1720 there were houses. In 1898 it burned. And so Isaac built a new house, and this is the house, and the summer kitchen, and the barn, the large barn, and the small barn for small animals, sheep, and so on. Now, this is the Richelieu River, and right here is the Ile des Chaillons. That island in the river plays a very important part at the end of the 19th century. And across the river is the village of Saint-Roch. Now, in the title, I have from and to, and by selecting those words, from and to me imply change, movement over time, and the habitants. The Canadian farmers did not call themselves peasants. They were landowners. They were pride of being landowners, and they were les habitants, the habitants. So that's why I have that in there. And then to immigrants, and by immigrants that connotes to me willingness to change, risk-taking, adventure, courage. And I tapped the experiences of the Sansoucy, Harpin, and Potvin families. Now, Leslie contributed an essay to the book, so her name is on the cover with the title of the work that she did. Now, I hope I pushed the right button to get to slide number 3.
Just a tap should do it. Yeah, there you go.
I'm going to use my little pointer better than my finger. On the back cover, I have the homestead of the Harpins. And the Harpins were on this land from 1720 until the 1930s. And there were 6 generations of Harpins who lived on this land. That house now has a bright blue tin roof, but it's still occupied, as the Sansoucy house is as well. I visited many times. The owners have been very gracious. They have taken us through the house and shown us the doors and beams and those parts of the house that are original from the turn of the 20th century. And then there's a summary of the book, and that's it. That's the back cover. Now, when I first started, I had absolutely no thought of writing a book. I thought I would just ask my cousins to write something about, anecdotal information about their parents, and just have it printed as we had done for my father's family. But my mother had left me a book by Couillard, a priest, Abbé Couillard des Prés from Saint-Ours, 2 volumes in French, and I read those. And on one page in the second volume, Couillard des Prés writes about my great-grandfather, Isaac Vel Sansoucy. And he says, in one sentence, he said in the book, Mr. Sansoucy is the descendant of an old soldier. That is all I knew, nothing else. And it took me a long time, a couple of years of roaming and searching. I had no idea why there were soldiers in Canada, or even which century there were soldiers in Canada. It took me a long time, and I Googled a lot, and I finally, by searching, I discovered that there had been a regiment, that there were soldiers in 1665 who came to Canada, and there was only one book about, told the story of the regiment, and it took me more time to locate the book, and when I finally did, it was in a small bookstore in Sherbrooke, and I was able to order it, and that gave me, that was invaluable, gave me the story of the regiment. Now, I made a lot of visits to Quebec, to Santos, to the Valley, and to Quebec. I started at the archives in Quebec a long time ago, more than 20 years ago or so, reading microfiche, and that was very difficult because it's in old script. And finally, when I came back to this project in the early 2000s, 2002, 3, 4, that's the period in which I was searching. When I came back to it, the University of Montreal had archives online, and they called Program in PRDH, Program in the Research for Demographic History. And this was invaluable. I was able to buy a subscription and renew the subscription all of the time that I was working. And this offered me two things. One, a chart like this. That's why this is up there, where I could enter the name of a couple, Jean-Pierre Potvin and his wife Marie-Angélique Thibault. They're the third generation on the Harpin side, but it gives me their parents and their family, and then the relevant dates, death and burial. And now in the archives in Quebec, they would give only the date of burial, and there would be an S, sepulcher, the day that they were buried. In Montreal, in these archives, they've corrected that, and they also include the date of death. So,
Marriages.
And marriages, right. So I wanted you to see the kind of material that was available. Now, the other kind of information that I was able to obtain from the PRDH there's a separate division where you can request contracts. So I sent in the names of families, couples that I was interested in, and then I received back a package of marriage contracts, sales contracts, debts later, right, after the loss of Canada, a great deal of debt. So that was also very helpful. Now, some other sources that I used were, there's another website called Le Mes Aïeux, that means my ancestors, and when I started to research and I was using the PRDH, it only went up to 1800. Mes Aïeux is more current, so it's useful. And some others, there's a professor at Marianapolis College in Montreal, Claude Bélanger, who has a very, very helpful website on French-Canadian history, and I use that quite a lot. And the Acadian home websites. And then I discovered, I read some French historians, Choquette and others, but I discovered some English historians, 3 in a row, Eccles, Mook, and Greer. And one was the mentor of the other. And I found that these English historians had a genuine, warm, compassionate interest in French Canada, and they were objective. And they wrote books on the peopling of French Canada, the French Canadian home. And the third one, Alan Greer, at the time was at the University of Toronto, and then he moved to McGill, but he specialized in the history of the Richelieu Valley, or the villages of Sorel, Saint-Orge, and Saint-Denis. That book, again, was invaluable. So in addition, when I came to wanting to know more about the immigrants, then I searched the local libraries. That's what brought me to Southbridge, the historical societies, and I looked at the town directories. Now, by reading the town directories in all of the towns around Worcester, you know, Leicester, Shrewsbury, Millbury, Grafton, I was able to locate exactly where the immigrants worked. I could establish their work pattern year by year by year to the best of my ability. I took oral histories starting about 30 years ago. Unfortunately, I didn't tape my mother. My mother was a consummate storyteller, and I could have taped her, and I didn't, much to my great regret, but I taped her brother, my uncle. It took me 13 years to complete this project, and another 2 years in publication. Publication of nonfiction, at least for me, was not easy. It means obtaining permissions, and I have numerous genealogical charts, 40 figures, so it was complicated. But you know, once I got into it, and I gained information about the regiment, and then I moved from one generation to the next, and it took an arc of its own. And I was just propelled forward from generation to generation, seeing people through colonization and war, and then a period of peace and some prosperity, and a revolt, and then immigration. And I was just moved forward, and there was no turning back. However, it was work, but I was never bored. Now, up here, I have two names. The two first, Harpin. The first Harpin was called F. In the Harpin family, the spelling of the names changed a great deal.
And in 17th century French, they would have said Harpin, even though it was spelled E-R-P-I-N.
That's interesting. As a matter of fact, as you'll see a little later, when the Harpins settled in the Bas behind away from the river, they spelled it A-R-P-A-I-N. Now, Louis XIV became King of France in 1643. He didn't spend his own money setting up little trading posts in Canada. He farmed that out to charter companies, private companies, and was quite detached from what was going on in Canada. By the 1660s, however, he had a very extravagant court at Versailles. He was in one war after the other, and he very badly needed money. And so his very savvy secretary, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, advised him to do two things. He told him, you have to tap those resources. In other words, exploit Canada. It has resources. It has wealth that you can benefit from. And secondly, you have to populate. So Louis XIV, the king, established Canada, Quebec, as a province, as another French province, like the provinces in France, with a governor and an intendant, that was an administrator, and the seigneurial system. And meanwhile, the English and the Dutch were competing for the fur trade, and they had to travel the Richelieu River to reach the Ottawa River and to go west to the Great Lakes trading areas. And they were the Dutch and the English, especially the Dutch at this time, were putting the Indians, especially the Mohawks, up to assaulting these small French trading posts, these little settlements. And so Louis XIV decided, on advice, to send a regiment. Now the regiment had about 1,200 men, 20 companies, and each one each company had a noble, usually, as the captain of the company. And so in Saint-Ours, where my mother came from, the captain was Pierre de Saint-Ours. Pierre de Saint-Ours. Now, when they joined the army, when these French soldiers from rural areas in France joined the army, they came with dialects and different backgrounds. And so in each company of about 50 men, they gave each other nicknames, names that would be accessible to all and easy to remember. So with Marie Harpin, this one, Marie Harpin de Potvin, they looked at him and they said, "Oh, you are from Poitou. You are a Potvin." D means called, so Marie Harpin, you are called or said to be a Potvin. So that's how he applied. Vin is from the Latin, come from, Poitou. So that's how he received his name. Now, I searched and searched for Jeanville because I had that book on the regiment, and he wasn't in it. I had the names of 400 soldiers known to have served in that regiment. I knew from reading Couillard des Prés that his name was Jeanville, or Vel at least, but I couldn't find him, and it took me ages. I found him 15 years later, after the regiment, and when there was a second wave of soldiers, a smaller wave of soldiers who came from France. So Jeanville came later. He was also from Poitou, but they looked at him and they said, "Oh, you are happy-go-lucky. You are a Sansoucy, without care, carefree. You are a Sansoucy." All right, so that's how he got his name. This is my uncle, my mother's brother, Max Sansoucy. By 1923 was in business as a builder, and this is the last instance that I know of where the Sansoucys still used the name of Vel. Throughout the 18th, 19th centuries, they were Vel Sansoucy. My grandfather was Isaac Vel Sansoucy. This is the last time that I see that. All right. Now, Louis XIV was told to populate. France at the time, Canada at the time, I looked up the population today because I had down 3,000, but I looked it up today, it's about 2,000.
3,000
Really?
in 1663.
Well, my computer information was wrong.
That was wrong. Yeah,
Okay.
it was 3,000.
All right.
But 63% male.
And I found 75,000 in the American colonies, is that correct?
That sounds right.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
All right, so the Canada was very sparsely populated. It was 2/3 male, and the soldiers, when the regiment had completed their expeditions, 400 soldiers had died, 1,200. 400 returned to France. There were no wives in Canada, or few, not enough to go around, and they didn't want any part of this wilderness. And 400 agreed to settle. So they needed young women. And these daughters of the king, they were called, I think, given a prestigious title, filles du roi, daughters of the king. They were orphans, very often raised in religious institutions. They were educated, they were literate, they were expected to be strong, healthy, able to manage a home, and they were given clothing, pins and needles, sewing equipment. When they left, they were given some money, a small amount of money, and when they arrived in Canada, they had certain rights. They could question a suitor. They could reject. They were not obligated to take a suitor. And when they did marry, they received cows, chickens, some animals to get them started, and
I gotta talk to you later.
and some cash. All right, now Leslie research, her book was about who were these people who came from France, all right? If you've heard of the Tour de France, it wasn't always a bicycle tour. Leslie?
Yes, it used to be that artisans, after they finished their apprenticeship, but before they were ready to set up shop themselves, you had to get married to become a master artisan and set up shop. So there would be a period of about 5 years where they would do a Tour de France, and there was a regular circuit of cities, and they would go from city to city. They might stay a week, they might stay a month, they might stay a few months. It mattered, depended on, what jobs were available. And so the idea was that they would learn how their trade was done in other places. They would sow their wild oats. Sometimes they would settle down before they ever finished the tour. They might marry the daughter of a master that they were working for or whatnot. Some of these towns where the Tour de France happened were on the seacoast, and maybe they didn't have any work in La Rochelle or Rochefort, but they found out that there was a boat going from Canada, and they could sign on for a 3-year contract at a decent salary, and they were like, well, what the heck, I'll do that. So a bunch of them came that way. A lot of them had urban backgrounds rather than, they weren't country folk, they came from cities. The men often had trade skills. The women, as Jackie mentioned, were often orphans who did not have the means to be supported by their families, so they got put into these institutions, basically asylums for poor people, where they received a little bit of instruction, but mostly just were made to work, and they had no independence, no ability to get out. So when the king's recruiters came in and said, hey, we're looking for strong, willing girls who are willing to go over to Canada, and we'll give you a trousseau, and you can get married, and you can have your own household, 800 of them jumped at the opportunity. And so there is, I don't think, a family of French Canadians or Franco-Americans who don't descend from some of these king's girls, and likewise who don't descend from some of the soldiers of that 1665 regiment, because they married early, they had a lot of descendants, and so they're really the backbone of the French Canadian and Franco-American population.
The consequence was they stabilized that Canada would survive in terms of population with these young women. Now, I put this word up, serendipity, because when you do research, it's not linear. You don't go, draw an outline and then research one thing and then have it produced. Right? There are tangents. And I had success and I had tangents. And I'll tell you about one tangent. I couldn't find Jean Bell. And for a while, I knew that the officers in the regiment could sometimes recruit their own men. And I knew that Pierre de Santos came from the Dauphiné in the Alps near Italy. And so I came across, by Googling, I found a book written by Abbé Bouton, a French priest, 1912, about that area. And it said in the write-up about the book that he described families from the Dauphiné. So I paid a lot of money, imported that book, I read it, Novelle family. So that was that. What I did discover, though, which was really quite interesting, was this is not very far from Marseille, from the Mediterranean, and there was an Egyptian influence in that area. There were Egyptian deities in that French area of France. So that was just a little byproduct. However, I went to Canada. My daughter, Christine, asked me in 2012 to take her to Canada, to these places of interest to our family. So I went with Christine and her 12-year-old son, Henry. And we drove into Santos, a little town, and at 6 o'clock on a Sunday night in June. and she needed gas. So she stopped in front of the gas pumps, and behind the gas pumps, there was a little convenience store, and it said, Harpin. So I went in and I spoke to the young girl, and I said, I'm really interested in the history of the Harpin family. And she said, well, if you go to the rectory tomorrow, Monday, at 1 o'clock, the ladies will be working on the archives. Serendipity. So I went, and the ladies were really delighted. They were warm, lovely, and delighted that someone showed interest in the history of their village. And they showed me a book. And they showed me a book by Jean-Louis Lessard, who was a retired engineer whose family came from Sansoucys, and he had researched every land transaction from 1854, when the seigneurial system ended, back to 1720, every single one. And they gave me his name and his email address. So when I came home, I emailed Jean-Louis immediately, and I said, I really would like to buy a copy of your book. And he emailed right back, and he said, I don't have any more, but here's a PDF copy. So I printed it, and with that, I was able to identify exactly where each generation lived on a piece of property, the concession that they had. So thanks to Jean-Louis Lachambre. So those are serendipity. Now I had another event. I wanted to know more about the early military history of French Canada. And I discovered that there was a doctoral dissertation and a master's thesis. I didn't find any books, just those two. So I bought the doctoral dissertation and read it, and I was able to borrow the master's thesis. And then by Googling some more, I found that J. Castle, who had written the doctoral dissertation on the early military, was at the University of Toronto. And I looked up faculty, Toronto, and I found him. And so I had an exchange of emails with J. Castle, and I asked questions, he answered me. And he also affirmed that I was on to the best secondary sources. So another, surprising thing that happened along the way. And the third one that I'll mention is my mother's letters. I knew that my mother had letters in the closet, but I took them out and I read them all, and I realized that she had about 125 letters written between 1909 and 1936. So there were about 80 of them between some of the letters were after 1936 into the 50s. They were not relevant to my project. But there were about 80 letters exchanged between the family here in Southbridge and Leicester and Worcester and the family in Canada in French. And I translated every single one of them, and I used them in the book. So those are the surprising things that can happen when you're doing research, positive and negative. All right. Now, some kind of amusing things happen when you're doing research. I Googled the name of my uncle, my mother's brother, Horace A. Sansoucy, and this is what I got. I got his son, who was on a football scholarship at Springfield College, and Springfield College was unloading early sports photographs, and I bought this wonderful family photo for $6. All right, now, back to the regiment. The regiment had two missions. One was to provide military protection for that small population living in Canada. They were living in tremendous fear. So that was their first mission. The second mission was to establish forts along the Richelieu River and to display the might of the French army. It was Louis XIV had the strongest army in Europe at the time. So these soldiers were sent over for those two reasons. They had two expeditions into New York, into Indian country, into the area where the Iroquois Federation, where the Indians were living. And the first expedition was in winter, in February. It was a total folly and fiasco. They were ill-equipped, they had no snowshoes, they had no ice clamps or any kind of equipment to help them over the snow. One blanket per man, digging a hole in the snow to sleep. They reached Schenectady and they had to turn back. All right. The second expedition was in August, where they had better leadership. The first time that they went, they had a very incompetent leader. The second time they were better organized, had better leadership, but the Mohawks down here in their villages they must have had reconnaissance, because they vacated, they left the villages. And so the regiment made it down through the swamp to the villages, and the Indians were not there. They ransacked the place, they took the corn and the provisions, but the Indians escaped with their lives, and the French returned to Canada, and by and large they survived. They didn't lose very many men, and they came home and announced their success, and the expedition of these regiment of the Carignan Salières Regiment is what it was called, achieved a kind of a halo of glory, celebrated in legend after that. But they were successful in the sense that they brought about 15 years of peace, and the colony would survive. And shortly after that, the colony would establish a militia, which was very successful in protecting French Canada until they encountered greater forces in 1759, the English army. Do you have comments on the regiment?
No, just to say that I think also part of its halo of glory is that they really did put the population on a sound footing by marrying the king's girls.
Now I have a lot of genealogical charts. My son-in-law helped me put together this PowerPoint. He did some kind of he got carried away with the technology. So this is the beginning of it. All right. Now, all of the names, this is how these charts work. The names are in italics if they are an ancestor.
A direct ancestor.
A direct ancestor. So here you have Mary Harpin and his parents in France. And then you have his immigration to Canada, a soldier, and so on. And he married the daughter of a fellow soldier. He was 43, she was 16, I think. Mm-hmm. All right. Now, on the other side, you have the ancestors of Jacqueline Coulomb, who was the first female ancestor, became the wife of Mary Harpin, and her ancestors and where they came from. And then immigration to Canada. And this one is particularly interesting because Françoise Thiers was a daughter of the king. Now, she married Joseph Coulomb when she was 15 in Canada, 1671. By 1667, she's a widow and has two children. Within 2 months, March to May, she's married to I think another soldier. And that marriage, interestingly enough, was annulled because they were required to have a civil marriage, but in front of a notary. It was a notarial contract. And then later the religious ceremony. And if they were unhappy in the interim, they could annul the marriage. And so their daughter was Jacqueline. So that's how those charts work.
We'll just move to do that.
Now, this is a contemporary picture, photograph, very recent. And I put it in here because my son Paul, my youngest one, said to me, Mom, why didn't you put in a map of Canada? You know, where is Trois-Rivières? And so on. So I take a minute to just get the geography straight. All right. This is the St. Lawrence River. To the south is Vermont, or New York and Vermont. And then this is the Richelieu River. Here is Saint
Starts in Lake Champlain.
That's right, leads to Lake, it drains the Green Mountains through Lake Champlain and the Richelieu. Now this is a point of land, and way over here is Sorel, and then Saint-Ours, and then Saint-Denis, and across the river is Saint-Roch. But now the first settlement, Mary Herpin and Jean Velle and Pierre de Saint-Ours settled first along the St. Lawrence, but that's close to the juncture of the two rivers, and it was too sandy. It was not good farmland. So they crossed this Indian trail. This was a trail carved out by the Indians, and they settled on the south shore of the Richelieu because this is where the land was the most fertile. But also, you see the way the land is surveyed in long strips. That's the way they surveyed the concessions. And what's important here is by 1720, or just after that, and they had relocated on the Richelieu instead of the St. Lawrence, they began to realize very early, second generation, that land was capital. Very important because it stayed with them even to my grandparents' generation. They knew that holding land was capital.
And the reason for the long, skinny thing was that the river frontage is what made the land valuable because of the need to transport your grain, get it to Montreal or wherever via the river. So everybody has a long, skinny thing going back from the river.
Okay, now a little bit about the seigneurie. Pierre de Saint-Ours was a minor noble, came from the Dauphiné, and he came from a town where there was a promontory on the side of a mountain, like the old man of a mountain, only it looked like a bear. So the place was called Saint-Ours, a holy bear, or Saint Bear, and his name, the name of the town, and his name was Pierre from Saint-Ours. That's where they got the name. Now, Pierre de Saint-Ours had this large area to give away to his soldiers, and he was given that large tract of land, but he had to add value to it, which means he had to find people to settle. And those settlers who accepted land were bound to pay him a tax each year. The land was free, but not free. They had to pay a tax every year, and they had to give a certain percentage of whatever they produced. So the land into the 19th century their ownership was limited it was restricted by their obligations to the seigneur. Now the seigneur he had a domain of his own, and each settler had to provide the seigneur with some time of labor on the domain of the seigneur, a day or two or whatever. Now, in geography, the geography of it is interesting. Now, this is the seigneurie of Sorel, and that was settled by Pierre de Sorel, another noble captain of a company. Below here is Contrecoeur, Pécaudy de Contrecoeur, another noble captain of a company. That's where those names come from, Sorel, Saint-Ours, Contrecoeur. Now, here you have St. Charles and Saint-Denis And those names will become very important at the time of a revolt. More than 120 years or so later.
1837 and
1837,
1838.
38. All right. Now, the seigneury was very significant because it induced settlement. It gave soldiers and their brides a piece of land on which they could support their family. But it also established the seigneurial system, and it made clear the class structure. In other words, for another 250 years, it was the labor of the habitants that supported the clergy and the nobility, and it was so the economic gains, the wealth was redistributed. The wealth of the labor of the habitants is what supported the other two classes. Leslie?
Well, that's
Okay. Now here's Jean-Louis Lessard's wonderful map. Now, these are the riverfront concessions, and you see how they are very long. They were approximately, an Harpin is close to an acre, just a little bit less. They were 3 by 30. Later, some of them were 4 by 40. They had those who settled first had access to the river. They had access to a road, the length of from Saint-Denis all the way to Sorel. And on each concession, they had a place for their house, and they all built right near the river. And that's why you see my great-grandfather's house. You don't see it. Well, you can see the island. You can see the river
right behind it.
Right.
Yeah.
They built near the water, and then they had to develop farmland. They had to cut down old forests, and when you consider that they did not even have saws, they had only axes and hatchets.
and fire. They burned also.
Right. And there's Louise Deschênes wrote a book on that settlement. I have excerpts of what they went through to colonize in the book. Now here, I draw your attention to Pierre Bell. He was the son of Jean Bell. And right next door is his brother Jean-Baptiste. And next door, right to his Pierre, Jean-Baptiste. And right here is Jean-Baptiste Harpin. So my two ancestral lines were neighbors. This map shows that they were neighbors. Now, Pierre Ville married Marie-Anne Potvin. Marie-Anne of Potvin. And Marie-Anne was the last of the teen brides. This is 1720, so the daughters of the king had been very successful in helping to populate Canada, and it was no longer necessary for teenage young women to marry, because they had access. They didn't have to wait for capital. They had access to abundant land and could marry at a young age. Now,
and there was a 50-50 population balance between men and women by then, so.
You want to, Leslie, this might be a good time to talk about women's rights under this era.
Yeah, so it's kind of dry, right? There was a civil law code called the Custom of Paris, and that was the legal system under the French regime, and the British government after the conquest continued to allow it to exist not for criminal matters, but for civil matters. So it's the legal framework for society. The family, not the individual, was the basic unit of society. And so the code was patriarchal because the father and husband was the head of the family, no question about that. But it was somewhat egalitarian also in that the wives had a share, they had rights to a share of the marital property, much more so than in the English common law. Also, it was very common for the wives to hold their husband's power of attorney. If he was in the militia and he was off on a military expedition, if he was involved in the fur trade, later on, if he was up in the lumber camps, she was the one in charge. She could buy, sell, do whatever kinds of transactions, and that was very, very common. The other way in which the code was more egalitarian than the English system was that all of the children, male and female, had equal inheritance rights. Which means if they want to pass the farm on to one child so that they don't break it into pieces that are too tiny to be useful, the child who is going to take the farm is responsible with the parents for paying off the other children so that everybody gets a share. So that's kind of the way the family economy worked under that system.
There's another way in which this map was very useful. This area away from the river is called La Paz. That means low. And that's because some of these lines through here are streams. The Riso is a stream. And this was well-watered, excellent farmland, low, away from the river. Now, when it came to the fourth generation, the Harpin family right there, Jacqueline up there, that family, but the fourth generation, my ancestor no longer had a place. Population was growing, and they were beginning to have to divide the land. And so my ancestor married in the year 1800, and I didn't know where to go. And because the stepmother was living on the land. And then I knew the name of the bride, and I began to look at the names in the second row. And then here's a Thibault, and Bro, and Benoit, and Carignan. Now, those are Acadian names. And by researching, I had a niece who was very interested in the Acadians and helped me with that research. But by researching those names, I already knew that one son, the son of Pierre Vell, had married an Acadian who had been exiled. And then by 1800, I didn't know where this young couple went, and I Googled the names, and I found that we had not one, but two Acadian female ancestors exiled to Massachusetts and then returned to Canada and married into the family. Later, the box filled in. This is the first row. The homestead of the Harpins is right up here in that area. But later there was a third row. They called them a row. There was a third, fourth, and fifth. There were third, fourth, and fifth rows. Okay.
Just to elaborate a little on the Acadians. So the Acadians are the French people who settled in what is now the Maritime provinces, especially Nova Scotia. And they actually were there before Quebec. Quebec was founded in 1608 by Champlain. He created his first settlement in the Maritimes in 1604, 1605, so even a little bit earlier. However, that land, and it was fertile land, it's now called the Annapolis Valley of Nova Scotia. That was the heart of French settlement. And they had diked it, and it was very, very fertile land. In 1713, in a war, the British got it from the French. So these French farmers are still there. They're pretty prosperous, and the English control them. So that was the case between 1713 and 1755. In 1755, the British and the French were about to go to war again. And the British were very worried that these French people that they were in charge of would support the French against them. Now, the French swore up and down that they wanted to remain neutral, but because they wanted to remain neutral and not support either the French or the English, they refused to sign a pledge to support the English. And so the English made the decision, the English with a lot of support from the governor of Massachusetts, whose people wanted to expand and take this nice fertile land in the Annapolis Valley. The British and the Massachusetts militia in 1755, right before the new war broke out, decided that they would deport the population. No warning. They gathered them together in the church, the biggest building that would fit everybody. They read to them the deportation order. They could take nothing with them, only what they could carry. And so they basically lost everything. They were put onto ships, families got separated, and they were just deported pell-mell to the 13 colonies. A bunch ended up like Jackie's family in Massachusetts, but they were all the way from Massachusetts down to Georgia. Of course, once they got to the 13 colonies with nothing, the officials in the 13 colonies are like, well, we don't want to have to pay for the upkeep of these people, and furthermore, they're Catholics, we don't want them here. So they end up actually getting scattered all over the place. Some get sent to London. From London, they get sent back to France. Some of them end up in the Caribbean. Some of them end up in Guyana. Some of them end up in the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. A big group of them come back to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, which is later under British rule. A bunch go to Quebec, so these guys in Saint-Ours. And then probably the biggest group goes to Spanish Louisiana and become Acadian, become Cadian, become Cajuns. So that's the connection. But these guys all ended up in Saint-Ours.
Okay, now the English who controlled what is now Nova Scotia at the time, felt that these people were obstacles to they were obstacles to the English ambition to control all of North America, and the colonies by now had a considerable population, and the colony of Virginia was looking towards the Ohio Valley, and down here in Massachusetts, William Shirley, who was the governor, had to import produce from Acadia, and had rocks and Indians and mountains between himself and between Massachusetts and the Ohio Valley. So they coveted that land, and so William Shirley, the governor of Massachusetts, was complicit with the government in Nova Scotia in the exile of all of these people.
My colleague Johnny MacFarriger of Yale has described this as an early example of ethnic cleansing in North America. Their objective, in addition to an economic one, and wanting to possess that land, that fertile land, as Leslie said, the Acadians had been extraordinarily successful in diking the marshes and farming and even exporting. They were extremely successful. But they were also, another reason why they wanted them out of there was because, well, ethnic cleansing. They wanted to replace them with Scotch, German, Protestants. Protestants.
Right. So in my family, in my family, Claude Benoit, who wound up in Santos, some of these people were exiled in 1755, and others in January of 56. The Gerard LeBlanc and families were exiled in January of 56. They were befriended, or they were befriended by a congregational minister here in Westboro. His name was Ebenezer Parkman, and Ebenezer Parkman knew them, kept a journal, and that journal is online. So, I just skipped, I have to backtrack a little bit. I put in 2 contracts here, and we're back to 1720 just for a few minutes. 1720 was when Jean-Baptiste Harpin, Harpin family, and his bride, Agnes Martin, moved from, they settled on the Richelieu River away from the St. Lawrence. And so what I had up there first was their marriage contract. I just wanted to show you what the kind of thing, the kind of document that you can obtain from the PRDH. So that was a marriage contract just before this one. I don't dare go back
Some
to
of
it.
them are a lot easier, some of them are legible, others aren't.
I could read a good bit, but
This isn't so bad, but some of them are worse.
now this is a permission for the 25-year-old son to marry.
25 was actually the age of majority.
Now, I've included, I talk about balancing what was going on, the geopolitical events that were going on, those forces that that had an impact on these people with their private lives, and I include this story of Agnes Martin. Agnes Martin was the wife of Jean-Baptiste Martin, who settled in 1720 on that long strip of land right on the river. She married in 1724. In 1725, she has a son, Jean-Pierre. In 1726, she has a daughter, Marie Agnes. In 28, she has another daughter, Marie-Tête. In 1730, probably with a fourth birth because infant mortality was high, she's dead. Within 2 months, well, not 2 months, she died, I think, in the spring. By August, her husband has remarried, he had to. And he remarries. He and his wife have 2 sons. The wife is expecting a 3rd baby, and he's dead. Jean-Baptiste is dead. So those are the kinds of real, stories of real people that counterweigh just the stories of war and economics. So now I'm kind of going to skip this because Leslie just talked about it, right? She just told you all about the story of the Acadians, and in my family they were exiled in January of 1756, found their way to Boston. They were treated as indentured servants. They were separated from their children and pleaded. I have in the book. I have a plea to the Massachusetts legislature to please reunite them with their children. They say that nature cannot tolerate this, and they offer to do any kind of work in order to be reunited with their children.
Just
very poignant.
These arrows here, this is New England, these sent to the British West Indies, these to the French West Indies, these end up in France, these end up in Quebec. So
Okay.
you just
Now,
gives you some
this
sense.
chart just very quickly because the Acadians lived in villages that carried their name. And this is the Annapolis River, and you can see here Melanson, Thibodeau, Gerard, Godet, Prince, all all names of Acadians. They lived in family villages like that. And they were exiled up here, or a little north of here, on the Minas Basin. Now, very quickly also the Battle of Quebec. The only reason I have the Battle of Quebec here is not to review the war, but to discuss the consequences of the war. Montcalm was up here with his army. He was expecting reinforcements from Montreal. The English were right here in full view of the Plains of Abraham. They were able to reconnaissance and to find the Anse du Fourneau, that's a cove, and they decided to climb that cove.
It's a real cliff, but they scrambled up it.
Totally unexpected. These are the English lines, there's Wolfe, these are the French, and here's the militia. And so our ancestors, many of them were in this militia. And these are French companies. The battle lasted about 15 minutes. Both leaders were killed. But the reason, well, there are many reasons why it was a turning point, of course, because England now controlled all of Canada. But after the war, there was an increase in commerce and trade. English law gave the French some rights, especially property rights that they did not have, and they brought 75 years of peace. From this period, roughly 1760 to 1835, a period of relative peace and prosperity. And however, on the minus side, after the war, there was an influx of traders, Yankee traders from New England, and these merchants set up in the rural areas, and they brought manufacturing goods and seed, and so from that point on, it put the French Canadian habitants in debt to the merchants. They bought, farm equipment, seed, and pots, whatever they needed, European goods. And from then on, so there's a wrinkle now in the redistribution. At first it was redistribution to support the clergy and the nobility. Now it is redistribution of the labor of the habitants to support the clergy, the nobility, and the merchants. And that class structure, that redistribution, affirmed that the upper classes had a stake in the status quo, and so of course had no reason to want to change it. Now, by this time, there's a third generation in the Harpin family, Angélique, Thibault, and Jean-Pierre. Jean-Pierre is the one son of Agnes that we just saw. So Angélique and Jean-Pierre, and in those contracts that I was able to obtain, there's one that shows that Angélique and Jean-Pierre were in debt. So those major events, such as war, the influx of Yankee merchants, result in habitants acquiring debt. I'm concerned about time, let's see. All right. Very quickly, so now we are in the middle of the 18th century. All right, the war is behind, and during this period. I'm going to go very quickly over this. This is what I call the era of wheat. There we go. Thank you. The era of wheat. You have villages begin to develop a bourgeoisie. Some people began to move at 1800. Right. Some people began to move into the villages. The shoemaker, the notary, the doctor, the tinsmith, and so on, the blacksmith. And so now there's a group of people who earn their living at providing services to the habitants. That's new. But also, it means that these people who are living in the village don't have the same agenda as the habitants. The habitants were very united. They could pull together, and in opposition to something that the curé, the pastor, the priest wanted. But now there are different factions, so that's a change. It's the beginning of inequality. Before this, one family was pretty much like the other. They were not really poor, but they were all quite even wealth. Now, the Yankees brought in the cultivation of potatoes, and so this is the wheat area. The farmers are able to sell that wheat and export it up until the American Civil War. Right? With some changes, there was a decline. But during this period, they were selling their wheat, and in the 1830s was the most prosperous decade yet. They were doing well, but the farmers were growing potatoes because they could subsist on potatoes and sell their wheat.
Same as in Ireland until the potato famine.
But then, in the 1830s, things began to change. The population now of Canada on the farms was very high, very, very large families. There were insect infestations in the crops, and the quality of life was threatened, but never destroyed. Inheritance changed. Leslie, do you have some comments about the inheritance? No. Okay. After the war and under English domination, there was a group of young French Canadian young men who began to study English law. They were 95% of the population, and they were governed by 5%. And so they began to read English law and to recognize their rights. They read Thomas Paine, they read the Declaration of Independence. The American Revolution had taken place. There were revolutions in Eastern Europe and in South America. So they were getting these winds of individual rights and government by the people, as opposed to the situation in which they lived. So they became aware of their rights, and in 1826, they didn't have any political parties, but in 1826 they formed one, and they called it the
Patriots.
Patriot, the Patriot Party, and Louis-Joseph Papineau was the leader. They were anti-clerical and very nationalistic and fierce about the freedom of the press. Their young French press was suppressed by the English. Now, in the assembly, there were two houses to the legislature. One was the assembly, and having 95% of the vote, the French Canadians could easily elect the majority in the assembly. And then there was another house, but they were appointed. And then there was a kind of a cabinet, which was also appointed. And those two bodies had veto rights over the assembly. So the assembly, though they represented 95% of the people, and had the right to determine or control the budget, were easily vetoed by the upper houses. So they began to chafe and to agitate. But one thing that they did, which was extremely effective, was that they informed the people. Karl Marx said that when people are, individuals and all living in a certain place, but not a community, that they are potatoes in a sack. And the Canadians were not potatoes in a sack. They had community. They met on the doors of the church. They met when they put up a barn. They met when they celebrated the holidays. They met plowing with next to their neighbors. So they met in the taverns. They were a community, and so the politicians took advantage of that, and they were on the church steps, in the taverns. They had the children. They were publishing as best they could. And so children were reading and singing little songs that had political implications, political aspects to them, to their parents. So they aroused the population, and they began to hold rallies. There was a huge rally in Santos with a platform, Joseph Papineau, banners, flags, slogans, resolutions. And then there were two battles. In St. Charles, you saw where St. Charles was on that map, right near Santos, and then another one in St. Denis. Now in the first one, in St. Charles, the British Army was mired down in mud and heavy rain, and so the farmers were actually successful. But in the second one, they lost because the English had learned in the American colonies after the Revolution, before, the English had their army was across the ocean. The logistics were terrible. They were not favorable to the English when they were fighting the American Revolution. They learned their lesson, and so in Canada they had an army ready.
Keep a standing army.
They had a standing army in Montreal, and so.
And as you can see, the Habitants were not exactly that well equipped.
No, that's what they had, farming equipment. I learned from this, and I saw it throughout from the very beginning, but I learned from this that the Habitants were not sheep-like. They were not a passive people. I reject that view. They were spirited, feisty, united, and fierce to advocate for their rights.
I talked about the consequences of the rebellion.
My son-in-law being a little dramatic.
So, as Jackie said, the British Army put the rebellions down by force, and they didn't mess around. 12 patriots were hanged, 58 were deported to the penal colonies in Australia, and 1,000 were imprisoned. Many more fled on foot or by horse and buggy across the border to the United States, into Vermont, into New York, and then they went to places where there was work. Places like Southbridge, which had a growing industrial economy and could provide work for them. So the community of Southbridge French Canadians, community as opposed to just like one or two here or there, dates from the period right after the rebellions. I should also mention that the most intense part of the rebellions, as Jackie says, was the lower Richelieu Valley. Huge rally in Saint-Ours, huge pitched battles in Saint-Denis and in Saint-Charles. So this is the heart of the rebellions, and people are getting out and they're coming here to Southbridge. So that's when the first real French-Canadian community forms here. And before long, you have a kind of transnational network of families, friends, neighbors, both here and up in Saint-Ours. That's what we call a chain migration, and that chain migration goes from the 1840s until emigration from Canada stops in 1930 with the Great Depression and with new anti-immigration laws in the United States that cut off immigration. But for 90 years, you have that chain of back and forth from the Richelieu to Southbridge.
This is my great-grandfather, Isaac, of Sansoucy. Isaac was a young man married in 1850 after the revolt. He had an older brother named Augustin. Augustin was present during the revolt. He was at least a teenager, during that time. And so Augustin was the first one Isaac's older brother, Augustine, was the first one to immigrate in our family, and he immigrated to Southbridge, and his great-granddaughter is right here. Raise your hand. Mona Sansoucy. Now, Augustine's son started the Sansoucy funeral home, and Mona's family has kept that. Now, Isaac had another brother, Abraham, who immigrated to Putnam, Connecticut, with his nephew, Jean-Baptiste. And so Jean-Baptiste had a daughter, had a son, who was also Jean-Baptiste. He was a very talented cutter of, he worked in leather and shoes, designing and cutting shoe leather. He married a very ambitious Irish girl named Maggie Burns. They had two daughters, Gertrude and Monica. Maggie took those, first of all, they moved to Minnesota because Rochester, Minnesota was a music center. And Maggie took those two girls to Germany. Jean-Baptiste remained in Minnesota, sent her $100 a month for 3 years, while the girls, Gertrude studied organ, the piano, and Monica studied the violin. They returned. Gertrude was very successful. She gave. Where shall I catch up with here? Listen, I'll come back to. That's Maria and Philip Bell Harpin. Here's Gertrude, a concert at Carnegie Hall. Here she is at the Pan Am exhibit in 1901. She was there the week that McKinley was there, and the week during which he was shot. And she also appeared at many other expositions. She was one of the first women to compose and print sheet music, songs. And so her story is in the book. It's a side story. It's a member of the family, not in the direct line. But again, that's what happens when you research. You can find interesting things. Now, this is my family. And now, remember that island and the river? This is the end of the 19th century. They can no longer support, from the 1840s on, they can't support their family with the family economy on the farm anymore. So they, and wheat, after the Civil War, the United States did not need Canadian wheat anymore, and neither did England. And so the wheat, they had to change to dairy farming and cheese factories. And so my grandfather, my great-grandfather was living in this house and one previous to this, and my grandfather had a large family, and so he squatted on that island. My mother grew up on that island. That was the best they could do. And this photograph was taken by an itinerant photographer. The father and the older brother are out in the fields, but it was those older brothers who were agitating for immigration. They had, one of my grandfather's sisters, Rosanna Sansoucy, married to an Harpin, was here from 1889, here in Southbridge. And right there, 20 North Street. This is a photograph supplied to me by Margaret. They had a grocery store and they lived at 20 North Street. I tried to find the place where my grandparents first lived, 71 Worcester Street, and I couldn't really identify it. The numbers have changed in that neighborhood. However,
But it's right near the river, I think, like right on.
It's across the street from
Yeah.
the American Optical Company.
Yeah.
And my father was born right behind that place on either Benefit or Dean. But you're right, the numbering and everything has changed.
So my family immigrated to Southbridge. They then they immediately found work with American Optical. But then they moved closer and closer to Worcester. They went to Charlton and then Leicester and then Worcester, where they had contacts and the men could enter into the construction business and the women could enter the factories. My mother wove carpets. Right. But take this into consideration. They immigrated in 1909 by in 1913, they lost their mother. By 1916, they were able, with that, I told you about that family economy, you know, and the concept of land as capital. By all working together, by 1916, they were able to buy farmland in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. And by 1921, they had a house. By 1923, my Uncle Max was in business. By 1924-25, my mother had a hat shop in Shrewsbury, and so on. So, and you can look at that and think, you know, that's a pretty smooth, successful road to success. But it wasn't as simple as that for all of the Franco-Americans, because one thing, the KKK was very active in New England at the time.
And particularly in Worcester.
And Leominster. And the KKK, their targets were blacks, Jews, and Roman Catholics.
Especially Catholics who didn't speak English.
So the French Canadians also were called the Chinese of the East.
That was not a compliment. It was, that comment was made a year before the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented them from immigrating.
So the French Canadians, in a sense, were assaulted, as the Acadians were, by people who wanted to either send those Canadians back to Canada, to frighten them and send them back to Canada, or manifest destiny. They had a vision of America coast to coast for white Protestants. So the subtext was manifest destiny. Just quickly, I would close with this photograph because it's a pretty neat photograph. Here, there's one Harpin, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, one is a Dominican priest. All right. This Harpin is married to Victoria Potvin. Her mother is Zoe Potvin, and the children are Harpins. Right. And Maria, a Harpin, is married to Philip Sansoucy. So in one picture, you have three families and 3 generations of Potvins and 2 of Harpins and Sansoucys. Pretty neat picture. I thank you for coming, and we would love to entertain your comments and your questions, and I'm willing to sign books.